Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs War Room Update. We are incredibly on day 271 of the war. That means 271 days where 120 Israeli hostages are being held in Gaza by the genocidal terrorists who carried out the massacre on the 7th of October. IDF forces are continuing to operate all through the Gaza Strip. The IDF Chief of Staff saying that in Rafah alone, is part of the operations there over the last few weeks, IDF soldiers have managed to eliminate over 900 terrorists, to uncover scores of tunnels that crossed between Egypt into the Gaza Strip, hundreds of entrances to those tunnels placed all over Rafah, within schools, within hospitals, within mosques, everywhere that the terrorists could use and abuse to put their terrorist infrastructure. That is what they did. In the north, we're carrying on also with that war of attrition with Hezbollah. Hezbollah continues to attack, to escalate its attacks, and the IDF continues to respond, albeit in a limited manner for the time being. Just before we came on and for this broadcast, news broke that the IDF had targeted and killed another one of the top leaders of Hezbollah, Abu Ali Nasser, who was a brigadier general in Hezbollah, or the equivalent of a brigadier general in Hezbollah, and the commander of the Aziz forces was taken out just hours before we started the broadcast today. It's the second high-level targeted killing that Israel has carried out in the last few weeks, signaling to Hezbollah that none of them are safe. Even their top leaders, they might try and hide, but at some stage they come above ground and then they are targeted. In Judea and Samaria, terrorism is boiling all the time. I cannot stress that enough. There isn't a quiet scene there. There have been terrorist attacks, shooting attacks, attempted attacks to plant bombs in all types of sites, and those have been responded to by the IDF, both with arrests. Yesterday we saw an incident where, again, IDF forces attacked from the air a cell of terrorists who were carrying out terrorist activity, including trying to plant bombs. Just this afternoon, again, also just before we came on for this broadcast, an Israeli Arab attacked an Israeli in the north, something which has been somewhat really very irregular to see in this last conflict. On the most part, the Israeli Arabs have stayed out of the conflict. Many Israeli Arabs were actually murdered on the 7th of October by Hamas, even having identified themselves as Israeli Arabs. Some of the Israeli Arab areas adjacent to the Gaza Strip have also been the target of rocket fire and mortar fire, and have sometimes ended with the death of some of the Israeli Arabs. And predominantly, as I said, as opposed to the violent events of 2021, in this war, the Israeli Arabs have predominantly stayed either neutral or even on the side of Israel in its fight against the genocidal terrorists. In the south, the Houthis are also continuing on with their aggression and their impediment to and ready destruction of the maritime passage through the Gulf of Aden and up into the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal. The terrorists there only allow ships that they care about to passage through. Other ships they attack, American ships, British ships, Israeli ships. All are subject to the attacks of the Houthis. Now, the guiding force, as we've said often, behind all of these attacks, the success of one specific terror entity, terror state, to create really a ring of fire around Israel from all directions, is Iran. Iran has managed to set up its proxies all around Israel, and has then managed to operate them and give them that order to attack Israel in a coordinated fashion. Iran continues to be that destabilizing factor, not only in the Middle East, but really throughout the world as the leading sponsor of international terrorism. So today we're going to discuss Iran again, because Iran just recently said that if Israel dares to respond in a more substantial manner to the attacks of Hezbollah, Iran will enter the conflict as well. And Iran, as they said, as their representative said clearly in the UN, Iran will operate to destroy Israel. This isn't something which can be taken lightly. And so today we're joined by, again, by Gabriel Noronha. Gabriel is the executive director of Polaris National Security. He's a JCFA fellow. He was an advisor to Congress on Iran. He was an advisor also to the Trump administration from 2019 to 2021 on implementing the maximum pressure sanctions on Iran. Really someone who understands the Iranian scene inside out and can help us maybe navigate through some of those questions that are coming up about Iran. So Gabriel, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So really, Gabriel, let's start maybe with the most basic idea. Iran at the moment, after the death of Raisi, is going through a process of elections. Who are the candidates? What's the difference between the candidates? Do they really make any difference for the West, for their support of terrorism, for the threat that Iran poses to Israel?
So we have just passed the runoff election. We hit the first round of elections last week, and we are moving on to the runoff election on Friday. We have two candidates left. Pezeshkian is what people call a reformist moderate, which we'll unpack whether that name has any meaning. And then you have Saeed Jalili, who is what is considered a conservative hardliner within Iran. Now, these are all sort of questions of whether those differences mean anything at all. If you are in this regime in the first place, you are a hardliner, but there are degrees of separation between that. Pezeshkian has criticized the regime for its crackdown on protests. It's advocated for closer integration with the West and Europe in particular. Still has actually said that the nuclear negotiations didn't make sense and that the JCPOA was stupid. But there are significant practical issues where Pezeshkian is saying, hey, we need to actually have financial transparency. We need to pass the so-called FATF reforms, which crack down on terror financing. Saeed Jalili, on the other hand, is very much in the meld of his predecessor, Ibrahim Raisi. He wants confrontation with the West. He was one of the nuclear negotiators in 2015, advocating deception and whatever could be done to strengthen Iran's hand in negotiations, and isn't interested remotely, I think, in any idea of rapprochement with the West. The issue here is that none of this really terribly matters. At the end of the day, the president in Iran controls the domestic cabinet, but all the decisions go up to the supreme leader. This is really an election for the number 3 or number 4 post in Iran. But again, it is completely subservient to what's called the revolutionary oversight. So you have the supreme leader, you have what's called the Guardian Council, which determines if laws can just be overturned or candidates can be disqualified from elections. You have the Expediency Council, and you have the IRGC, which really, at the end of the day, runs foreign policy and national security decisions, along with the Supreme National Security Committee. The president would sit on that committee, but they're basically more like a prime minister or a senior cabinet level official. So at the end of the day here, I think people should pay a lot less attention to this presidential election on Friday and more attention on what's happening behind the scenes, the succession competition for the next supreme leader. Ibrahim Raisi, who just died, was considered to be the contender along with the Supreme Leader's son, Moshtaba Khamenei, to replace Ali Khamenei when he dies in probably a 2 to 5 years. Now the ground appears to be set for Moshtaba to take the reins as the next supreme leader on his father's death. But now there's also sort of ground opening for a shift in the Iranian political system and possibly someone new coming in to be a contender there. One thing that we've seen in this election, the first round had election turnout at 40% of Iranians. This is about half of what it was 15 years ago. We have seen a massive decline in Iranians even going to the polls. And the reasons are pretty clear. Is the vast majority of Iranians now believe that the system is entirely illegitimate. And so they don't want to participate in those elections because they see as their participation has given legitimacy to what they consider to be the charade. At the end of the day, before you had the first round of elections, the Guardian Council went and disqualified anyone who it didn't even consider to be worthy of being president. And that included individuals like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was the former president for 8 years of Iran. He himself was disqualified for even running for president. And so that is the reason that this is very much a stage-managed election. Even the so-called reformist candidate has been approved by Khamenei and his inner circle. So there's not a lot of grounds for choice and a lot of difference here in terms of what's actually done. And at the end of the day, any law that they want to pass can get blocked or rewritten by the Supreme Leader and his inner circle.
So it would seem, from what you're saying, Gabriel, that really the elections were not only choosing the next internal leader, as it were, but really a show of dissatisfaction by the Iranian people from everything that's going on. That really a vote of no confidence, showing that this is really a farce. And even the distinctions between the hardliner and the reformist are clearly minimal, and so it doesn't really have an impact. How do the Iranian people actually go about making that voice more powerful, apart from not going to the elections and not going to vote?
So we've had the rounds of protests. The largest were in 2015 and then in 2022. And those both ended pretty poorly for the protesters. In 2019, you had perhaps as many as 1,500 slaughtered in the streets. Back 2 years ago, you had probably 500 to 800 slaughtered, and thousands on thousands put into secret prisons. That has put a damper not only on the leaders of the protest movement, but also on sort of your general Iranian population who's going to say, what's the point of taking to the street and doing these public protests if it just lands me in prison or the morgue? And I think what you're seeing now is a lot of Iranians are saying, we are going to wait, we are going to bide our time, and we're going to look for the right moment to make our voice heard. I suspect, and a lot of experts expect, that will be at the death of the Supreme Leader, that will be this inflection point, a major inflection point, where Iranians can say, we are done with the system, and we're going to use that as the catalyst to try to bring about some actual change. My concern there is that the regime has really strengthened and clamped down on any nascent protest, any dissent, and they are working overtime to be able to identify and disrupt any protest, any meaningful effort to change the system from the outside. And they will respond very, very forcefully. Now, it's going to be very interesting to see what the United States in the next election takes a different track about protests, whether it is going to be a little bit more explicit, advancing the Iranian people's desire for regime change, or whether we have sort of the status quo policy of saying nice things, but not really giving material support to the protests and advocates of regime change internally.
And it really does seem to be a substantial clampdown on civil rights, on human rights in Iran. It seems that it's really turning more and more, if that was really possible, into almost a police terror state where any type of dissent is immediately crushed. And even though 60% of the population, or a large percent of the population, show their dissatisfaction by not coming out to vote. It seems to me that it's a message that's completely lost on that leadership. Does that other voice have really the ability, given the numbers of people killed, given the violent response of the regime? Is that something that will change? You mentioned, for example, that Khomeini will be potentially succeeded by his son. Are any of these people going to give any type of greater freedom to Iran?
One thing that I've noticed when you listen to the regime elite talk amongst themselves, and even at the most recent presidential debate inside Iran, you actually saw a clear recognition that they know that their own people view this whole exercise as illegitimate. And the supreme leader and several other officials were saying, look, we aren't even getting people to turn out for our own elections. We are doing something wrong here. The people do not trust us. Iran is a little bit different, I think, than China in the sense that they will have these conversations openly in public and admitting, hey, the people think that this is a complete corrupt and ineffectual system. But then their solutions to it are nonsensical or even worse. It's very much like a double down approach. On repression, one thing they've taken from the Chinese playbook is the idea of high-tech repression. What they have done now is they've installed security cameras really across the country, and they're pairing them with facial recognition technology, largely actually to try to control women. What they will do now, after the protests in 2022, which were instigated by the beating of a young woman who wasn't wearing her hijab correctly, is they now say, you see a woman walking down the street without her hijab, the facial camera recognition software will identify who it is and send a ticket in the mail to that person. If they continually don't abide in wearing their hijab, they will possess their car, they will kick them out of their apartment. They're basically trying to depersonify anyone who breaks their law, but they're saying we don't want the physical in-person confrontations quite as much. We would prefer to do this through our software system. So again, very much like the Chinese social credit system, where they are trying to take out the conflict, but govern through a little bit more bureaucracy. I don't think that's going to end well for them, and I think there's still an immense amount of frustration among the young Iranian population against this system, and it's only going to engender more opposition and deeper desire to boycott or leave Iran entirely. So you're seeing a lot of brain drain from the top talent. This is another thing the leadership recognize. They say, this is a problem that our best and brightest all want immediately to get out of the country.
But are they leaving the country to go and join other forces, or are they going as almost agents of the Iranian regime into universities, into other think tanks, into all different mechanisms, not necessarily to get away from the thought process of the Iranian regime, but rather to enjoy the freedoms of Western society and any other freer society?
You have a bit of both. So you have on one side, you have your doctors and athletes and scientists who legitimately just want a better life, and they want to be able to do their work in peace and freedom, and they're going to want to go to Europe and the United States. And then you have your political agents and your intelligence agents who are trying to disguise themselves as dissidents and get into the institutions of the West. We have, I think, a significant infiltration and intelligence problem here in the United States. I think in European think tanks and government positions as well. There's been a lot of exposure of this in the last year, and the publics are starting, and security apparatuses are starting to wake up to this. A lot of the things that they will do is they will phrase themselves as refugees and dissidents. And then they get to go back and speak at conferences with regime elite in Tehran. And so this is pretty transparent of what they are doing. It's very difficult, however, to sometimes disentangle legitimate differences of opinion and people who are intelligence or information operatives. And the regime loves to use think tankers in particular to try to influence public opinion. They had a very adept program under Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, partly through the Iran, what's now been exposed as the Iran Experts Initiative, but through many other means to try to change Western opinion, particularly in the United States, with the idea that twofold, that sanctions did not work, and that when they ever did work, all it did was it hurt the Iranian people, and it didn't hurt the regime. That tells you just how desperate the regime was to get sanctions lifted. But it was a quite effective PR and propaganda program that led a lot of media folks in the West to write scores and scores of pieces, especially when I was at the State Department, talking about how our sanctions were inhumane, and then they either didn't work or they worked too well, but they never worked the way that we said that they did in the minds of these people. And that was a very thoughtful campaign by the Iranian foreign ministry.
But really, in actual fact, the sanctions were actually very effective. They prevented the Iranian regime from really amassing massive fortunes that they then use for all of these illegitimate purposes, and prevented them from marketing all of their goods around the world. It's something which had a direct effect both on their mindset and on their actions. Is there any question that really those sanctions worked much more effectively than the absence of any sanctions?
So I think the evidence here is quite clear. In 2019, 2020, when we had these maximum pressure sanctions on Iran, they were only able to export around 300 to 400,000 barrels of oil per day. That normally served, their oil revenue normally served as about 40 to 50% of their government revenue. That means that they had to take on huge amounts of debt, which was not sustainable, and ultimately cut their funding for terrorism, military budget, all of which decreased by double digits year on year. And what we didn't see was actually that much change to how the average Iranian operated, because they were already suffering from severe economic corruption and mismanagement from the regime. The regime wasn't investing in roads and bridges and schools before sanctions were imposed, and they didn't invest in them after sanctions got imposed. And what we've actually seen in the last 3 years, when the US sanctions have been pretty mild, is that the Iranian poverty rate has actually increased. And part of that is because the Iranian oil revenue that goes into the country, it doesn't go to the people, it goes straight to the IRGC and the terror apparatus. And so the regime has raised taxes by 400% in the last 3 years. They're basically choking off the Iranian middle class and lower classes through these taxes. Again, they have all the priorities of a terror apparatus and not a normal nation. And that's reflected in their budgeting, which I pour through pretty regularly. And so this is in economics, this is the classic guns or butter question of, if you have a limited amount of means, do you spend it on guns and military things, or do you spend it on domestic goods? The regime always chooses guns over butter. But if you can shrink that pie altogether, you will force the regime, one, to decrease its military spending, but also it will lack domestic legitimacy. At the end of the day, the Iranian voters are also Iranian taxpayers, and they want to see schools, roads, and infrastructure. And when they don't see it, they're going to rebel against the government. So these are all things that you can do to weaken the Iranian government apparatus and make them face conundrums back out.
And really, so I know this may be a little bit of a simpleton question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there the other side of the coin in Iran? Is there any open discussion, not amongst the leadership, but really freedom of the press, freedom, the ability to write articles saying we want to see more infrastructure, we want to see more roads, we want to see more schools, we're less interested in exporting terrorism around the world? Is that voice even heard in Iran? Does it have a platform to work on?
You do at times have this. Now, sometimes you will have large open letters, which are led by intellectuals, academics, notable figures. In some of these instances, you'll have a mass letter that says something along those lines. They'll let it circulate for a couple of weeks, and then they throw them in prison. And it's sort of there's a level of dissent which they tolerate. There's a level of open discussion which they tolerate, and they want sort of the combat of ideas internally. But then once it gets to criticism of the regime, criticism of the supreme leader, you can get thrown in prison for 10 years and more for, quote, insulting the supreme leader. So there are clear limits on what you can and cannot say and what are acceptable arguments. There was a large debate in the Iranian parliament 5 years ago over their banking transparency policy. The hardliners who won all argued that we needed the ability to send money to Hamas and Hezbollah without any interference. And you had a group on the other side that said, look, we want to be integrated in the world economy, and we can't do that if we're sending money abroad to terrorists. And so we need to pass financial transparency reforms. And Khamenei and the regime sided with the pro-terrorist faction and said, this is our priority. We don't want economic openness with the West. We want to be able to fund our proxies however we want. That is our priority.
I mean, it's amazing to even hear the idea that they're trying to come in line with the FATF regulations on terror financing. They are massive funders of terrorism all around the world. The Iranian banking system doesn't have that transparency. It isn't subject to even the most elementary of regulation against terror financing, because the financing is coming from the regime itself. It's not the individual on the street who's possibly involved in terrorism, but it's institutionalized via the regime, via the IRGC. That's not something which is going to change. So this idea of maybe reforming the Iranian banking system seems to be somewhat of an irrelevant red herring.
And one of the things that's very interesting about this is the Iranian government will often complain about sanctions and their inability to do business in the West. They have the ability tomorrow to fix this. If they wanted to be able to do banking transactions, even with China, with Russia, they could do this. They have a clear pathway of you pass 12 different reforms and you can now get off the FATF's blacklist and you'll be able to do business with the rest of the world. So it is a very conscious decision they've made, saying, nope, we choose not to do that. We choose to be isolated because at the end of the day, we know what our priorities are. And you're right, this is not, in the old days, 20 years ago with Al-Qaeda, you had lots of terror financiers in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arab world, individuals, bad apples, sending money to these terror groups. Here it is, the government apparatus from root to stem is the one carrying out, conducting, and structuring all the support for Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, the Iraqi militia. So yes, you're absolutely right. This is state-led, not individual-led.
So that really is maybe the bridge that can take us to where is Iran going internationally? We see that it's a isolationist on its and its demand to continue funding terrorism, even in its internal banking system. Externally, it seems that Iran it really is operating to extend its control, extend its sphere of influence all around the world, in South America, definitely in the Middle East, trying to undermine even the Jordanian regime. It seems to be that meeting of possibly dissent from home is then boiling over to aggression around the world. Is that really a connection, or is one just separate from the other? Their plan is to create terrorism around the world, and it just happens to be at a time where there seems to be growing dissent internally.
The Iranian regime bears similarities to ISIS, but it differs on one key area, which is the idea of sustainability. Whereas ISIS swept across Iraq and Syria, and they would put out videos of them burning pilots in cages. What ISIS's view was, they were going to confront the West and bear zero compromise. Iranian regime's view is, we are taking the long view on this. We are a century-long, maybe more, goal of slowly but surely transforming the region into a Shia vassal network of the Iranian regime, and ultimately, in the words of Ayatollah Khamenei, to create a, quote, brilliant Islamic civilization around the world. So that is their long game, but they also recognize they need to have financial ties with the rest of the world. If they want to do that, they need to be able to trade to bring in an income. And so they try to simultaneously undermine governments in the region, like Jordan, like Bahrain, like Saudi Arabia and Yemen through the Houthis, like Lebanon through Hezbollah. And at the same time, they want to be able to have peaceful relations or diplomatic relations, at least, with the same countries so they can have this idea of credibility and legitimacy abroad. They want to have their embassies and diplomats in Europe so that they can go shop in Europe and sell their goods in Europe. But they also want to be able to sell drugs and weapons to Latin America. So they try to have their cake and eat it too. And by and large, they have succeeded there. In the last 3 years, I think what we've seen is Europe is soured on Iran. Last decade, they were very much interested in the nuclear deal and doing trade and opening economic ties to Iran. And they've really, I think, had sort of a change of heart as they've seen Iran support Russia in the war in Ukraine, as they've seen Iran's nuclear program advance. What we see Iran succeeding in massively is repairing its image and relations in the Middle East. 4 years ago, Iran was completely isolated. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, many other Arab states had just cut off ties with Iran entirely. We have now seen Iran repair its ties with Saudi Arabia. Bahrain has repaired its ties. Egypt is on their way to reopening formal diplomatic relations shortly. So that element has been successful for Iran. I think the big two for Iran are Russia and China. Russia on the political and military support networks, and China on the economic side. However, Iran, both the government and then the people themselves, are pretty distrustful, I would say, of the Chinese government. There's a lot of public discontent, public mistrust of China and their agenda. Their parliament passed a resolution of condemnation of the Chinese ambassador at one point, and basically tried to kick him out of the country over a row. The Iranian people are a little paranoid. I think that they believe that the Chinese are trying to buy their land. So there are limits to these relationships and limits to how far they can engage with sort of their axis of China, North Korea, and Russia.
It really would seem that the Iranians have this, as you said, this 100-year plan. They're willing to take things slowly, but they have that ability to also directly engage, whether on all different types of fronts, and to find what could possibly be the soft underbelly of each of these countries, providing Russia with UAVs for the war in the Ukraine. This is something which has been a substantial part of their policy and really a testing ground for their weapons. So that's something which seems to have really succeeded for them in with the rapprochement or coming closer to the Russian regime. And it seems that they have this meeting of interests as figures that are undermining I don't know, the world peace, as it were. From whatever way. To what extent are all of these things dictated, Gabriel? Also by, and you mentioned it previously, you touched on it, the approach of Europe. When Europe dives headlong into the JCPOA and then is hesitant pulling out even when President Trump pulls out, when the US administration under at least the Biden administration talks again about re-entering into the JCPOA, talks which obviously didn't really come to anything but release and relax the sanctions. Obviously, these are actions which I would assume the Iranians see as emboldening them and not deterring them.
I think Iran sees Europe as the ideal customer. If you've ever shopped in a bazaar in the Middle East, the price that you say at the outset is not the price you're supposed to actually accept as the customer. Europe is the rich and clueless buyer who enters a shop and accepts the first price that they are given. They have been led manipulated and cajoled successfully by the Iranian regime for years. And I think what the Iranian regime said was it believed that they could continue to get away with it. And when Russia started their war against Ukraine, Iran saw an opportunity to sell weapons, sell drones, and potentially missiles to Russia, and didn't expected they could get away with it, which they largely have. Europe has still refused to snap back the UN sanctions, which prohibit this trade in the first place. They've refused to leave formally the JCPOA. They've refused to reinstate their banking and oil sanctions against Iran, even though Iran has violated its commitments on the deal for 5 years now. And so Iran's view was it could push and push and push, and nothing would happen, and they could get away with it. And they've gotten away with virtually everything. I would say the one area where they have suffered is their diplomatic reputation. Europe has now suffered significantly, but their economic ties and their political efforts have succeeded still after all this escalation.
And they have that entire black fleet of oil tankers that are running around the world, transferring black fleets. For our audience that don't know, Iranian oil tankers that leave Iran, they join another oil tanker somewhere in the open sea, turn off all types of communications and electronic signals, transfer the oil, and then you have oil that can be shipped around the world by a legitimate provider, and therefore providing Iran with that, as it were, plausible deniability and that opportunity to circumvent the sanctions. And that seems to be something which even Europe, again, Europe was tremendously affected by the war with Ukraine, Russia being one of the largest providers of gas and oil prior to the war. And now it seems like that European need for the Iranian source of fuel is only something which is going up. So we can't necessarily see any type of indicator that Europe is going to become more stringent in its approach.
So I think, one of the big issues here is that we are now trying, as the West, trying to reduce both Iranian and Russian oil exports at the same time. That's difficult unless and until you have cooperation from the United States and the rest of OPEC producers to fill that gap. So, in 2012, Iran was exporting about 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. Probably like pre-2010. International sanctions have gotten down to 1 million barrels of oil. And so the global production had to replace that 1.5 million barrels of oil. When we put sanctions on in 2018 through 2020, we brought them from 2.5 down to nearly zero. What replaced that was US oil production. But now we have the effort to try to take 4.5 million barrels of Russian oil off the market, in addition to the 2.5 from Iran. That is ambitious. And it's difficult, and it's not worked very well. And so if you're Europe, if you're even India or China and Japan, this is a Herculean task. If the United States was pumping 17 million barrels of oil, we're currently around 12 and a half, that is something that we could do. But the global market dynamics simply aren't allowing this right now. I also think it's been mismanaged by the Biden administration and by the G7 and European powers who've been really ineffectual with this. The Ghost Fleet tankers are now doing, frankly, what the free market wants them to do. There's not enough oil on the markets to be able to sustain oil prices at $60 a barrel or lower. And so the Ghost Fleet or the Black Fleet tankers are filling that niche. And frankly, the United States is looking the other way. We know this is happening. We put some sanctions on here and there, but you don't have what we saw 4 years ago. 4 years ago, 5 years ago, we would see many of these Goat Fleece tankers have engine problems. I'll use that loosely. And you saw lots of these tankers break down and have little explosions. You don't see that anymore. And I think that's because ultimately at the end of the day, governments are paranoid about what their consumers are paying at the pump. to fill up their car, and that has dictated a lot of this global strategy.
So this seems to be something which maybe is overlooked or is misunderstood, that the effect of the weak approach to Iran, this lack of desire to really take a strong stance against Iran, is something which is pushing Iran to further and further push the limits. When they see that they can get away with more and more without any type of reinstating of the sanctions, without any type of other sanctions, without any type of consequences. So that means that they really are free to do whatever they want. Just this morning in Israel, there was a publication that appeared to claim that in a conversation between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu after the Iranian attack on the 14th of April, 13th, 14th of April, President Biden apparently said to Prime Minister Netanyahu, if you attack in Iran, you're by yourself. Now, this is something which would seem to be completely contradictory to what you said, or what appears to be in America's best interest. America doesn't have an interest in allowing the Iranian people to suffer under this dictatorial regime. It doesn't have an interest in allowing Iran to promote really chaos around the world, funding, supporting, and driving terror. It doesn't have an interest in Iran being entirely inactive or entirely oblivious, I'll say, in restricting itself and its oil exports. All of these things seem to be something which America should, the U.S. administration should be dealing with in a much more with a much more heavy hand. That isn't the case. So what's driving at the moment the thought process of the U.S. administration?
I think this administration is obsessed with one thing above all others, and that is the idea of de-escalation. That's a generous word to say that they are focused on appeasing all enemies, which is my personal political view. But their intellectual approach is, they say there's so much discord and war across the world already. We want less of it. We do not want more crises around the world. We cannot afford more wars as Biden approaches his reelection. And so his overriding policy throughout the world is try to avoid escalations. The issue here is that is not how you deter enemies. Enemies have to believe that we are willing to fight wars, that we are willing to escalate the situation. And that is, in fact, the best way to prevent those wars from escalating in the first place. I think it's shameful, frankly, that that conversation happened between the president and Prime Minister Netanyahu, that we would say that you're on your own. That being said, there are tough conversations that have to be happened, but they should never be made public. It is entirely inappropriate for a leader conversation to be leaked on the front page of the New York Times, in Axios. I will say both sides are doing this a lot. I don't think it's helpful for the relationship. I think both sides need to cut this out entirely. There should be zero public record of any conversation between the US president and the Israeli prime minister that is in the press. This has gone on pretty badly for the last few years, but even in the end of the Trump administration. In World War II, you did not have public readouts of the conversations between Churchill and FDR. The Germans and the Japanese had no idea what we were plotting and planning. And that is exactly how it ought to be. And so this public display of disagreement and discord is really immature, I think, on across our governments. It is not productive. It is very helpful for the Iranians. The Iranians get to go read all of this in our press and say, oh, how can we divide US and Israel apart? Again, we are doing the Iranians a favor when we do it, when we air our dirty laundry like this. Adults should be able to have tough conversations in private and leave it at that. And so I hope that we go back into that situation.
I think you're absolutely right, Gabriel. I don't think that some parts of diplomacy should be splashed all over the front page of newspapers or on computer screens. There are things which are best not said, and if said, kept behind closed doors. But that isn't always the case when you're talking about diplomacy between countries. And sometimes it does just seem to have that almost childish effect of trying to run and tell everyone, well, look at what he did to me or I did to him. I agree with you entirely. I don't think that's necessarily very helpful for either side. Gabriel, as we come to really to the end of our time, a word of hope maybe for the Iranian people. Is there an opportunity? You said that Khomeini will potentially leave the scene in the next 2 to 5 years. For people like him, that change is always an opportunity or a window of opportunity to do something differently. Is there really going to be that opportunity for the Iranian people? Will they have the ability to stand up and say, we're not interested in this trajectory anymore? What do we think can be done in order to support and promote that opportunity, or using that opportunity to make a fundamental change in Iran, which will not only be for the benefit of the Iranians themselves, but also for the benefit of really of world peace?
So I often think that Iran today is very similar to the Soviet Union in 1982, 83. It is broken, it's sporadic, the people do not trust the government, but their leaders are going to come to an end shortly. Now, you could have two different models out here. You could have a Gorbachev type figure who comes in and says, we are changing this and we are going to ultimately bring down the system. Or you could simply have an ineffectual, unpopular figure like a Nicolae Ceausescu who loses the faith and trust of both the military and the public, and it all comes crashing down. I certainly hope that's going to happen. I think whoever comes in as the next supreme leader is going to have very little to none to no public legitimacy, no public support, and they will have to either give that back by changing the system entirely, or they will fall, and the Iranian people will hopefully, and this is my preferred outcome, kick them out and end this regime for all and impose a better government that respects their rights and freedoms. That government could have zero animus towards the Israeli government whatsoever. There is no geopolitical reason that the Iranian regime needs to be the sworn enemy of the Israeli state. They do not compete for resources. They do not compete for land. This is an ideological chosen enmity between the Iran and the Islamic Republic has for the state of Israel. If you had a better government come in, they could overnight repair ties with Israel, and you could see water engineers coming from Haifa and Tel Aviv coming in and giving hope to the Iranian people, refilling their wells, making Iran prosperous again, free again. That is what I hope happens. We'll see if, history sometimes goes the ways we want. Sometimes it goes even worse ways, but there is certainly hope, I think, that we can bring this regime to an end soon.
I think that's definitely true. I think many people tend to forget that from 1948 to 1979 till the revolution, Iran and Israel enjoyed very close ties, even with joint infrastructure projects that had been carried out, and really that connection between the two countries, the two people, that could and should return. Let's really just hope that window of opportunity that will open up with the passing of Khomeini will really provide that opportunity to change the face of Iran from being a terror supporter to being a productive, which it so could be, productive player within the Middle East. And their ability, I mean, you touched on it for very, very briefly. Iran's water system, or part of its water system, is to a great extent one of the wonders of the world, 1,000 years old, if not more, and is completely being destroyed, crushed, and is falling apart. And every year, Iran is losing more and more productive land because of their inability to bring water to those areas. and the cooperation with Israel, really a world leader in desalination, in irrigation technologies, making the desert bloom, literally, is something that really could be mutually beneficial. Gabriel, thank you very much for your insights. I will, as I always do, reserve the right to come back to you again as we see these subjects really developing more, because I think there's no chance that Israel is going to allow Hezbollah to carry on attacking without a more substantive response. And once Israel does respond to that, there is that potential of really bringing Iran into this whole process, as they've promised to do. In the meantime, though, that's what we have to provide. So again, thank you for joining us, Gabriel. And to our audience, we will see you again next week. In the meantime, stay safe and have a good weekend.
Thank you all.